As we all know, the DRC is in a severe security crisis. Armed rebel forces, including the notorious M23 rebels, have taken over vast amounts of the nation's territory. The government and its military appear to be too weak to handle the crisis. Other neighboring countries, including Kenya and South Africa, have tried to handle the crisis and engage in peace talks, but all to no avail. In a recent move, the authorities of the DRC have announced that they are in talks with the US to exchange their mineral resources for military aid to deal with the crisis. This is pathetic and shows the world that African countries are incapable of dealing with their crisis. The question is, for how long will African countries continue to depend on the West for security? What has been the position of the African Union in insecurity across the continent? These and other questions are what we will analyze in this video. Recent reports suggest that the administration of President Felix Tshisekedi is currently in talks with the US and some European countries. The purpose of these talks is to offer direct access to the country's abundant resources in exchange for offering military aid to deal with the crisis. The president reportedly wants the US to buy a stake in the country's vast economic sector. As earlier stated, the DRC is in a severe security crisis. The M23 fighters, who are backed by Rwanda, have made major advances in parts of the mineral-rich east of the country. The East African regional forces, including Kenya and South Africa, have failed to hold back the rebels. These rebels continue to advance into the country, taking control of vast lands. Recent reports suggest that the rebels are preparing to head west in a bid to seize the capital, Kinshasa, even though it is 1,600 kilometers away. If this happens, there is no doubt that this will be the end of Tshisekedi's government. Seemingly with nowhere to turn to, President Tshisekedi has decided to turn to the US. On the 22nd of February 2025, the DRC president is reported to have said that the Trump administration had shown interest in a deal involving strategic minerals. He was referring to the mineral deal that Trump proposed to the Ukrainian president. Interestingly, a day before he made that statement, a lobby group, the Africa-USA Business Council, wrote to U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio on behalf of a Congolese senator describing a possible deal that included an economic and military partnership. So it's not just President Tshisekedi who is in on the deal. The lobby group was acting on behalf of Congolese Senator Pierre Kanda Kalambai, who chairs the Senate's Defense, Security, and Border Protection Committee and is affiliated with President Felix Tshisekedi's party. In a letter to U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the Africa-U.S. Business Council proposed granting the United States exclusive access to the Democratic Republic of Congo's vast mining resources, valued at over $24 trillion. The DRC, as the world's largest supplier of cobalt and a major supplier of copper, tin, and coltan, holds strategic importance for U.S. defense and high-tech industries. While there are not many details on the proposed deal, sources close to the matter reported that representatives of both sides are actively negotiating behind the scenes. In fact, the Financial Times reported that as of March 8, 2025, discussions have recently gained momentum. But what exactly can the US offer the DRC in terms of security, and will it end the conflict as the president hopes? Before we proceed, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. According to the letter sent by the lobby group, the US would strengthen the country's military cooperation. This would involve training and equipping soldiers to protect mineral supply routes, giving the US access to military bases to protect strategic resources, and replacing ineffective UN peacekeeping operations with direct US DRC security cooperation. Now, if this is truly what the Congolese government is expecting the US to provide in exchange for direct access to its minerals, then the government is absolutely stupid. The reason we say this is because none of these areas will end the conflict. The US forces will only protect mineral supply routes, but what about defeating the rebels and stopping them from taking over the country? The worst thing about all these is that the US cannot offer more than this. According to Stephanie Walters, regional analyst for the South African Institute of International Affairs, if Kinshasa wants a US military presence in the East, then that is not very likely to happen. The reason is because of Trump's America First policy. This policy has also affected the U.S. military expansion policy in Africa. Recent reports revealed that Trump intends to reduce the U.S. military presence in Africa. So, it's highly unlikely that Trump would agree to send U.S. soldiers to directly intervene in the fight against the rebels. Now, even if Trump agrees to send U.S. troops, the question is, what is the guarantee that the U.S. forces would actually end the conflict? History has shown us that U.S. military interventions have resulted in more chaos and destabilization in the countries it intervened in. Most of the time, the U.S. left those countries worse off than they were. Libya, Iran, Afghanistan, and Somalia are perfect examples of the cost of the U.S. interventions. Is it that the Congolese government is not aware of this history? Meanwhile, in all of this, it is the U.S. that would gain more. The U.S. would have direct access to Congo's resources for a cheap fee and at the same time reduce China's dominance in the sector. In addition, Congo would remain a mineral export country with no plans for industrialization. The Congolese government would watch as American companies make good use of the minerals to build industries in the U.S., boosting their economy. This is pathetic and annoying. When will African countries learn? History has told us that African challenges can never be solved by the West. African challenges can only be solved by African solutions. But the old generation of African leaders seems content to continue on the same path. The same mineral deals that they made decades ago are the same deals they continue to make. Deals that do not favor the general populace as a whole. At a time when the Sahel leaders, including President Traore, Assimi Goïta, and General Tiani, are fighting to take control of their national resources, leaders like President Tshisekedi are ready to sell it for cheap returns. But then again, if you think about it critically, can you truly blame the DRC president? Since the security crisis started, what has been the response of the highest body of Africa, the African Union? When Russia invaded Ukraine, European countries rallied round to send support to Ukraine. This is why Ukraine has been able to survive till now. And even now that the US has decided to pull back from supporting Ukraine, some European countries have still maintained support. But in Africa, the case is completely different. African countries are the worst at supporting each other. There is nothing like African unity. Over and over again, we have seen it happen. One African country would be in crisis, and instead of the rest gathering together to help, that country would be left to deal with the situation alone. The highest they would do is to come out to say that they sympathize with that country. This is pathetic, but think about it. Africa has more than 50 countries each with its own military. If all 54 African military forces come together to fight against the rebels in the DRC, there is no doubt that those rebels would not stand a chance. It is exactly the same thing that would happen in the Sahel countries, which have been combating their insecurity alone. If all 54 African militaries work together, those Islamist insurgents would not stand a chance in the Sahel, Somalia, Libya, and any other country dealing with insecurity. But who will organize these countries? It ought to have been the African Union, but everyone knows that the African Union is the most useless African organization ever formed. It's not a surprise that President Traore sent a strong message to the African Union early this year when the DRC crisis began. In an interview, Traore expressed his disappointment with how the African Union, an organization created to ensure African unity, has been dealing with the crisis in the DRC. He said, "Children of Congo have been dying for years. Several other conflicts, including the one in Sudan, have existed in the continents. We would have liked to see the African Union generate the strength and strategies necessary to support its state so that it could find peace. We will not even talk about us in the Sahel region. For nearly 10 years, the Sahel has been the scene of international terrorism, but we see no support from these organizations to find a solution." Traore's words ring true. Think about it. All across the continents, there are countries that have not found stability since independence. Others have experienced severe insecurity for decades. It's either there is a civil war with one group fighting the government or it's terrorism. These countries include Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, the DRC, the Central African Republic, Sudan, and Libya. Even those countries that have a sense of stability and security, such as Nigeria, Ghana, and Togo, still deal with insecurity caused by terrorists. Despite the fact that this has been going on for decades, the numerous blocs in the continent, including the African Union, have not been able to offer tangible support to any of these countries. The highest the African Union has done is to talk and talk. It's pathetic. Each of these countries has been left to deal with the crisis, and with no choice, they have to depend on foreign Western help. But even that has not solved the problem. The insecurity has brought in numerous Western military forces, including the US, France, Germany, and Russia, just to name a few. But despite the presence of these numerous forces with high-grade military intelligence and equipment, the insecurity has only worsened over the years. But how is that possible? In most cases, the terrorists or armed rebels fight with lesser-grade ammunition, yet these foreign military forces have not been able to eradicate them from the continent. In all of these, it is the civilians who are left in the crossfire. The situation is frankly infuriating and pathetic. It's obvious that these foreign militaries are not interested in helping to fight the insecurity. This means that it is left for Africans to deal with the crisis. However, the Apex African organization has not shown any capability to solve the crisis. But is it really surprising that they cannot when the African Union is a puppet of the West? More than 50% of its funding comes from Western countries, so how can it make reliable decisions? The African Union was established in 2002 as the successor of the Organization of African Unity, which was founded on the 25th of May, 1963. The AU carries the heavy responsibility of fostering unity and cooperation among African states. Key to its mandate is the promotion of peace, security, and stability on the continent. This critical objective is geared towards creating a harmonious environment conducive to socio-economic development, political stability, and the overall well-being of the African population. Each of these exams simply means that the African Union has the ability to respond to crises within the continent and work towards sustainable peace. However, the AU has also failed numerous times to ensure peace. The African Union had pledged to silence the guns by 2020. However, by 2020, Africa had excessively high levels of conflict in the continent. There were about 656 armed conflicts that took place between 1990 to 2020. Now, to mark the 50th anniversary of the creation of the African Union, African leaders pledged to ensure sustainable and permanent peace on the continent. They promised not to leave the problem of conflicts to the next generation of Africans. The pledge was followed by the adoption in 2016 of the Lusaka Roadmap to end the conflict by 2020. The document outlined 54 practical steps that needed to be taken to realize this roadmap. They focused on human security issues. They ranged from adequately funding the African standby force for deployment to preventing the rebels or insurgents and their supporters from having access to arms. Other steps included fighting human trafficking, corruption, and money laundering. Interestingly, peacekeeping is the core of the AU's mandate and an integral component of conflict resolution within Africa. The AU's Peace and Security Council operates under the principle of African solutions for African problems, aiming to manage and resolve conflicts within member states through mediation, sanctions, or the deployment of peacekeeping forces. Historically, the AU has been involved in managing some conflicts, providing peacekeeping forces and mediating disputes to restore stability. Its involvement in Liberia and Sierra Leone's civil wars, for instance, saw the deployment of peacekeeping forces and facilitation of peace talks, contributing significantly to the resolution of these conflicts. In 2017, AU played a key role in alleviating the Gambia's political crisis by pressuring then-President Yahya Jammeh to accept election defeat and step down, thus averting a potential civil war. Each of these exams simply means that the African Union has the ability to respond to crises within the continent and work towards sustainable peace. Despite the comments of the African leaders' ambition for Africans to provide solutions to their problems, they have, from the onset of this declaration, faced multiple challenges and failures. One reason for the failure is that the 2020 milestone was too lofty, given the number of conflicts on the continent. The next reason is that many of the conflicts are internal, arising from the protests inhabitants have with their governments, which have been ignored from the outset. An example of this is the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon that was neglected from the onset. Furthermore, the numerous crises in Africa that the AU was not able to resolve, including that in Côte d'Ivoire and Libya, showed the inability of the AU as an African solution to African problems. If the AU had taken a very strong unified position when these crises broke out, it would have stopped the eventual and direct intervention of the UN and France in Côte d'Ivoire and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as well as the United Nations in Libya. However, the African Union could not solve the crisis in Libya and allowed NATO to intervene. NATO intervened and left behind chaos and destabilization. Despite the failures, the success achieved by the African Union implies that the African Union is capable of solving crises in the continent. All it has to do, as Traore has suggested, is to stand up and take action. But if the African Union cannot take action, then perhaps it is time for it to be dissolved, and all African countries should heed the call of Traore and join the AES. Now, while we can understand the position of the DRC president, it is so important to note that leaders like President Traore have refused to sell their country's resources in exchange for cheap help. Not only are they managing a security crisis, they are also trying to develop their countries with their mineral resources. Niger, for instance, has been hard at work in recent times trying to reclaim control of its uranium sector. Since independence, Niger's uranium sector has been dominated by the French uranium mining company, Orano. As you know, uranium is a mineral that is used to produce nuclear power. And after discovering it in Niger, France quickly entered into a series of agreements with the leaders of Niger at the time, which enabled it to have unrestricted access to the mineral. In return for this access, the leaders in Niger were guaranteed military security and protection from the threat of terrorism and internal threats such as local political opposition. Niger's uranium, which was acquired at a cheap cost, was then used to produce power in France. This meant that Orano became the sole producer of uranium in Niger, controlling a larger percentage of the mining sites. However, the entrance of Niger's military leader into Niger's political scene changed everything. Like Traore, the military leader of Niger decided to take some steps to reclaim Niger's economic sovereignty. First, he suspended the issuance of new mining licenses in January this year and ordered an audit of the sector. And then he revoked the operating license that allowed French nuclear fuel producer Orano, formerly Areva, to operate one of the world's largest uranium mines. He has also kicked out Orano from the country and is currently looking for better uranium deals for his country. Now, what about Burkina Faso? Well, during the last Russia-Africa summit, President Traore gave a brilliant speech about his thoughts regarding Africa's current state. He said that he has always wondered why Africa was poor despite its abundant resources. And then he came to the conclusion that it was because of Western countries and their companies working together with weak puppet African leaders that have made the African continent as it is. It was from this point that Captain Traore pledged to do things differently in Burkina Faso. Traore has completely taken over the gold sector of Burkina Faso, reclaiming it from the hands of terrorists and Western companies. He has suspended gold exports and built a gold refinery and a waste mining facility. Right now, Burkina Faso has begun to produce its own locally made gold bars. These leaders are examples of how the same can be done in the DRC. Instead of making cheap deals, the DRC president can take advantage of its vast mineral resources to industrialize the country. If the DRC is industrialized, armed rebels will be a thing of the past. It is poverty and lack that have made members of the rebel group cause chaos. If the authorities in the DRC can look into the core issues, then it will be able to solve its crisis. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comment section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and share this video.